Most watch brands are lying to you. And believe me, I wish I could tell you it's just clickbait, but it's not. In the world of watchmaking, there is nothing that gives you more prestige than saying that your movements are made in-house. That you design them, you develop them, you prototype them, and you assemble them all inside your factory. Because whether you believe it or not, it's an extremely complicated process that very few brands manage to do. Especially when we talk about small components like the hairspring, that almost no one can produce a hairspring. That's why it's impressive to say that your movements are in-house. And that's also why many brands have taken it upon themselves to lie to consumers, who, let's be honest, normal people don't really care what kind of movement the watch has. They don't care about how many hours of power reserve it has, and they surely don't care about the frequency or the hertz it vibrates. So why do watch brands go to such lengths to lie and deceive the people who buy their products? And here go some examples. Some time ago, Tag Heuer released the Caliber 1887, which was an in-house chronograph movement. In fact, it was a very well-decorated movement, and it was for the Carrera line, which is one of their most iconic lines. It was a good watch. But a few months later, people investigated and they realized that Tag had lied, and that in-house movement was actually a Seiko Caliber. Obviously, Tag argued that they bought the design and modified it in their factories, and that's why it was an in-house movement. All of this after denying everything. But of course, people didn't believe it, and Tag was just a disaster. And just like that, many brands buy a generic movement. In this case, it was an in-house movement by Seiko. But a lot of brands buy an ETA caliber, Celita caliber, or even Chinese movement. They decorate it, they change the rotor, and done. They just add the logo of the brand on the rotor and it's done. They say it's an in-house developed movement. And I think that as customers or consumers, or at least me, the watch nerd, and you, because if you're watching this, I'm pretty sure you're a watch nerd, we should demand more from the brands. One of the only brands that I've seen that clarify where their movements come from is Oris. If you go to their website and look up most of their watches in their information section, even if it's like the Oris Caliber 433, it will have a disclaimer that says it's based on the Celita movement. But now what really makes me angry and annoyed isn't that they use basic movements, because basic movements are great, they're easy to fix, they are very reliable. What's annoying is the part that they want to deceive their consumers. Not just people, their consumers. Now, the topic of in-house movements will always be controversial, starting with the definition. Many brands see an in-house movement as something modified. Others see it as, if I design the movement, then it's in-house, even if someone else manufactures it. Or, I bought the design from another brand, but since I have the rights and I am the owner of the design, now it's my in-house movement. So I think there are several gaps that create confusion, but also leave the panorama open for brands to deceive people. Another way we are deceived is when conglomerates use the same movement for different brands. For example, what do Tudor, Chanel, Breitling, and Norqain have in common? A normal person wouldn't know. They have nothing in common. But what they have in common is that all of these brands that I listed use the same in-house movement. It's a movement created by a company called Kenisi. But since these four brands bought Kenisi, now they all use the in-house movement. And each one gives it a different name, but it's essentially the same machine, the same movement. Or another example, Tudor and Breitling made a deal. Tudor needed a chronograph movement, and Breitling needed a normal three-hand movement. So they made a deal and each one used each other's movements. So they made a deal and each one used each other's movement. They baptized it as an in-house movement. For example, the Black Bay Chrono movement is a Breitling chronograph movement. and the three-handers from Breitling are using a Tudor movement. Now, another example with much higher-end brands would be from the Richmond Group. Jaeger-LeCoultre is considered the watchmaker of watchmakers. Throughout its history, they have created thousands and thousands of movements, but the Richmond Group owns Jaeger-LeCoultre, but they also own Vacheron Constantin and Cartier. Now, it's not a surprise that these brands use Jaeger-LeCoultre movements, but they baptize them as in-house movements. So to what extent is it considered an in-house movement? If your brother develops some technology, can you use it as if you had invented it? And I repeat, what annoys me is not that they use generic movements, not that they modify movements or decorate them. I just think a bit more transparency would be better for the community. I mean, of course, this is not going to happen because there are many brands that are very expensive that use generic movements like Hublot. Well, this transparency would surely result in a decrease in their sales to some extent. Because we all know, at least in the watchmaking community, we all know Hublot uses Sellita movements. And probably the people outside don't care. But this would surely, if they were transparent in this, it would decrease their sales. At least a bit. But what do you think?